Hi, everyone. Thank you. Oh, hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Sort of at the end of semester. Hopefully, everyone's feeling a little bit lighter. You know, the sun's out. Thank you to everyone who's joining us online today. Michelle will be presenting on the risk-averse generation this evening. And you can, if you are online, you can ask questions on slido.com and just type in the code 72022. The page definitely is working today. We've double checked, and we will keep an eye on all the questions. So we're good on that front. And Michelle, thank you, and looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me here, and I'm looking forward to discussing some research in the area of children's outdoor risk-taking, in particular during recreation and play. And so today, what I'm hoping to discuss with everyone is why it's important to consider children's risk-taking right now, and what's been going on over the past maybe 6 decades in terms of shifts in parenting, and also sort of this risk aversion that's developed within Western societies. And so to begin, I'll just introduce myself. For those who don't know me, I'm happy to see some familiar faces. My name is Michelle Bauer. I am a postdoctoral fellow in the Faculty of Medicine in the Department of Pediatrics, and I work in the BC Injury Research and Prevention Unit under the supervision of Dr. Ian Pike. Currently, my work focuses on understanding children's perspectives on neighborhood safety and injury and play experiences. And this is to really work through empowering relations with children, with families in Vancouver, to make neighborhoods a safer place, but also to incorporate some desirable play opportunities. And I'll skip this slide because I think it was just introduced, which is great. So to begin, I just wanted to get everybody a little bit sort of loose and ready to discuss this topic. So I'll start with a little bit of an activity. And I just want us all to sort of take maybe 30 seconds to just close our eyes. And I'd really like everyone to imagine a time in their childhood that they think of when they think of fun play. So any moment in time that brings back this type of joy associated with play. Okay, I see some people sort of opening their eyes or ready. Now, I'd like you to raise your hand if when you were imagining this type of joyful play, if you were imagining something outdoors. Okay, so for those sort of at home or watching through a Zoom link, everybody in the audience has indicated they were thinking about something outdoors. I'd also like you to raise your hand if this was something where you were physically active. If you were playing with other people at the time. Okay. And sort of when you think about anything that could be risky, without any definitions of risk, do you consider yourself taking any risks during this time? Okay, so everyone. Great. This helps with the discussion. This is wonderful. Now, what I'd like to do is just have us discuss this a bit more. So, Liz, I'm wondering if you could share anything to do with this moment in time you were imagining, what it consisted of, perhaps what this risk was that you were imagining.
Cool, this is really embarrassing, so I'm glad you called on me. So, elementary school playground, and I can't remember the exact details, but we were all a different Sailor Moon character, and somehow this involved like going up and down slides, going on monkey bars, and presumably saving the world with our various powers, but like all in the context of this elementary school playground that like, because you're on monkey bars, like you could fall, or like you're going up the slide the wrong way, someone could be going down the slide. So I think those are like the risks that I'm thinking of.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. And I can definitely relate to the Sailor Moon stage.
Yeah,
that's great.
Excellent.
Okay. Rory, you also raised your hand. Would you be willing to share that moment?
Yeah. Maybe not as embarrassing, but definitely more stupid. So I was thinking about when I was younger, my cousins and I, when we would go down and visit our grandmother's property in Niagara-on-the-Lake, it was right on the lake. So probably about a 20-minute walk through some orchards and stuff was this little cut, and there was sort of like an irrigation outlet that led down to Lake Ontario. And it was kind of like a rock beach, but it had also been secured with a bunch of like housing and construction waste. So there was like concrete slabs and lots of old bricks and bits of twisted rebar. And my cousins and I would just go down there and play for like hours, completely unsupervised, right by the water. So we were that started when some of us were like 2 or 3 years old.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Great. And so the risky part of this for you when you raised your hand for risk, what was that? Was that the access sort of to those materials
just like
around
proximity to the water,
Okay.
proximity to like dangerous materials, like
Okay.
yeah, that kind of thing.
Great. Thank you so much for both sharing. And so we will actually be talking about elements of what you've described throughout the discussion. And so when we think about sort of risk-taking more generally, we can think of it in terms of categorizations, for example. And I should mention there are a wide array of definitions for risk. We tend to discuss it as neither positive nor negative, just sort of probability, challenge, thrill, excitement, things like this. But there are some categories that we can consider when it comes to play. And so this can be, for example, play at great heights, when a child could be reaching for that extra branch when they're climbing a tree, sort of pushing themselves a little bit more out of their comfort zone. So things that are thrilling to them, exciting, often self-directed activity. And so I heard, Liz, you mentioned some of this imaginative sort of play on the monkey bar. The risk was associated with potentially falling. And Rory said maybe the water, close physical proximity to water and things like this. Okay. Now, one last activity for all of you. I've put 4 phrases or words on the board here. And I'm just wondering if you can take maybe 10 seconds just to look at the words, just reflect on them. And I want you to think about whether or not you've heard them before. Now I'll ask you to raise your hand if you have heard of one or any of these words. Great. Okay. Now, I'm going to pick other people because we've already had 2, volunteers. So Eric, I'll start with you. What word have you heard, and in what context have you heard this?
Yeah, so mainly the middle 2, the coddled and bubble wrapped, and
Okay.
the context is kind of working at day camp, and because we're like relaying messages to staff, and we have to kind of deal with parents all the time directly because they go home, ask their kid how their day was, and they find out kind of what they were doing, any kind of potential small injury, whatever, and because of that, it's kind of known kind of in the community and the industry almost like this is kind of the way kids are and their parents are as well, and how they treat them.
Great. And I heard you mention sort of this minor injury and perhaps this guarding against minor injury as sort of shaping coddled or bubble wrap discourse. Is that right?
Yeah, and as well as kind of the communication from the kids to parents, like blowing it out of proportion.
Yeah.
Like one kid said they got hit by a shovel and we didn't know about it, but it was just a plastic shovel in the end.
Okay.
But like the parent was freaking out. So yeah, part of it's communication, but yeah, I think in general, they kind of blow things out of proportion.
Okay. And I like how you sort of phrase that, blowing things out of proportion, perhaps when it comes to injury experience. Okay. Heather, I noticed you also mentioned that you've seen a word. Would you be willing to share sort of what word you've seen, what context?
Yeah, I think coddled is a big one that I've heard a lot too. I've never really worked with kids, but I have friends who are teachers and, hear some stories.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So these words are sort of around the same discussion around sort of children's risk-taking, their play, their activity. And we commonly think of this in terms of what the audience has just said, right? Sort of this aversion to the serious injury versus minor injury. And what does that constitute? What can that be conceptualized as? But really sort of this overbearing sort of on children, this overprotection where they don't have this perhaps freedom of mobility, freedom of experience to overcome on their own. And so this is important because today we will be discussing the restrictions that are placed on children's play outdoors and the shifts in society that have culminated in this type of risk aversion. And so over the past 6 decades, there have been instrumental shifts in parenting and as well in children's freedoms to actually engage with risk in their environment. And it's to the extent where certain researchers, such as myself, will actually dedicate quite a lot of effort to understanding what risk is conceptualized as within different families, and what shapes those conceptualizations to better understand how to shape environments, improve them, and work with families so that children have those balanced opportunities to be safe while also engaging with their outdoor environments. And so what we see now, much more than, let's say, 6 decades ago, is children playing around their yard, around their backyards, and in close physical proximity to the home. So they're much more in structured environment. And we see this as synonymous with the rise in sport and sort of this structured outdoor activity versus sort of restrictions placed on where children can roam freely, unsupervised, and independently. So there's much fewer play in outdoor natural environments such as forests where there are not man-made materials, and lakes and sort of rivers and things like this. And so we can also see this with fewer children now even playing on playgrounds. And if they do play on playgrounds, there has also been a shift in what those playgrounds will look like and feel like to the child. So you'll notice, even if you walk around Vancouver, that most of the playgrounds here use plastic equipment, or they'll use very static-oriented objects that are not necessarily maneuvering. So what this does, as we'll discuss, is sort of restrict children's ability to learn from their outdoor world as they're interacting with it. So it does offer some opportunity to engage in that type of mobility and that type of activity, but perhaps not to the degree that we would like to see to offer children safe alternatives to expressing themselves through risk. Now, it's important to consider why this has been occurring. And so, first and foremost, in my own research, which I will use sort of as examples along the way, we consider the societal expectations for what good parenting is. And so we've seen shifts in this along the way. So 6 decades ago, we saw parenting as, at times, especially in rural environments, as a bit more unsupervised. You'll often hear perhaps your parents, your grandparents saying, well, I was just expected to be home before dark, right? I was at home when the street lamps turned off, and that was okay. Now in Western societies and other countries, when we look at Australia, when we look at Ireland, the Netherlands, and other countries, we see that there are actually these restrictions placed on how parents view their children's outdoor mobilities. And so there are far more restrictions placed on children's independent navigations of their environment, so how far they are able to roam without an adult present or without any supervision from parents or caregivers. And so these have led to serious decreases in where children actually play outdoors and how comfortable they feel accessing environments. And so in some of my research, for example, with digital technologies, what we're finding is the normalizing of the use of check-in points or tracking devices, so that children will actually expect to have cell phones and will want cell phones at times for the sole purpose of checking in with parents so that they can actually visit friends. So this is sort of synonymous with also children accessing these mobile devices at younger ages. Now, there seems to be this almost normalizing in society now with regards to the elimination of threat. So this idea that risk is negative, it's something that needs to be mitigated, and a parent is a good parent if they are actually able to eliminate that threat. And so there are definitely tensions within this. So when we think of gender discourses around good mothering versus fathering, for example, we can sort of unpack that a little bit and see that there are tensions with regards to what traditional roles are expected of parents within the home, what is expected of them in leisure and play and recreation activities outdoors with children, And so an example of this could be, for example, sort of pressure that mothers feel to protect their children and to provide that level of supervision. And so now across research, even in rural areas and Western societies, we see that mothers, for example, are worried about their children being left unsupervised outdoors. And so while you might think that this might be different for the rural versus urban comparison, we are seeing this increase in actually sort of lessening of this divide. And so this ties into sort of other things, industrialization, urbanization, and we'll talk about that as well. There's also this poor differentiation between serious versus non-serious injury. And so we see this even when we're dealing with Statistics Canada and what they're releasing on hospitalization information, medical practitioners, and sort of who we call authorities in the area when they're discussing with families and with children. And so very little research to date has actually examined families' perspectives of what constitutes a serious versus a non-serious injury, and what that means in terms of accessing hospital and healthcare service. So newer research is actually demonstrating that there is quite a difference with how families and children are categorizing risk as well as the injuries they experience. And so these categorizations can differ based on family environment and dynamics. As I mentioned before, there's also this increase in sort of industrialization and urbanization. And so this poses other serious threats, right? When we think of traffic or we think of cars, especially in this sort of rural ideal that's now being, increased with cars and access to street play for children. And so we see this in the literature when we speak to families about what concerns them about allowing their children to play unsupervised outdoors. And so, of course, the risk is perceived by families as being much greater for younger children, so 2 to 4. However, we do still see this for 13-year-olds, 12-year-olds, and 11-year-olds. And so what parents can do to actually mitigate threats associated with the outdoor environment when they're worried about cars, when they're worried about strangers around their children, is they can put up blockades and barriers. Oftentimes now you'll see fences around children's play area to designate particular spots around the home where they can play. There's also now an increase in driveway play, where you can see installments of the gates around the driveways so that they don't have access to the streets. And so when you actually sort of look in the environment as you drive through, even in Vancouver, you will actually see differences in terms of perhaps how you were playing as a child, how those around you were playing, versus sort of this idealistic play now with the mitigation of risk. And it's important to say that this is all contextualized depending on family environment. So there are litigation concerns and consequences that can be associated with negligence, right, or perceived negligence of a child. So if a parent feels that they're not being a good parent and that those perhaps adoption privileges could be stripped, they could be viewed or ostracized by their community as being a bad parent if their child is injured while in their care. And so I've worked quite closely with non-traditional fathers, single stay-at-home and gay fathers, to understand their views on parenting and risk. And what we actually find and see is that there are these concerns around what happens if my child is injured while in my care. I'm already sort of last on the list for adoption. If I do have a child, what happens then? And so there are a lot of sort of fears around actually having children injured while under people's care. And we also see this for educators. And so this is now has become quite a big conversation in risk research to understand how educators view risk, but also what they're able to do in their own agency within their professions and their occupations to engage with risk in some way in playground and other environments with children. And so this comes up sort of again and again when we think of how to balance sort of parents' fears while also understanding their needs. And so altogether, this is sort of a societal shift towards risk aversion. And it's to the point where some risk researchers will call it the future of a dystopian future for children's play, where they are seriously sort of concerned, especially in different communities, where children's risk-taking is being mitigated severely. And what I'd like to do is provide a bit of an example for why we talk about sort of allocation of resources towards risk and towards injury mitigation. And so I use the England playground example because this really struck a chord with me when I was learning about it. And so in roughly the 1980s, there was a commercial that was released on children's sort of injury at playground. And there was a lot of uptake through this sort of commercial in the public with regards to fear around allowing children to play in sort of hard surfaced environments. And so within a 10-year period, the English government actually invested about 200 to 300 million euros to change the playground environment to make sure that the surfaces were no longer hard, but smooth, so that if children fell, if they hit their head, which was the major topic of concern, that they would be, hopefully not be seriously injured from that fall. Now, at the time, researchers were saying in the area that the allocation of those resources would have been better spent on other types of activities. So, for example, there was a lot of talk around the installment of playgrounds in low-income neighborhoods. And this is because around the same period of time, within that 10-year period, about 1,300 children were hospitalized due to being hit by a car. And so in different areas, such as low-income neighborhoods, where there are at times more physical proximity to hazards, so unforeseen threats in children's environment that can cause serious harm. We think of construction sites, we think of perhaps holes in the ground that children cannot foresee and therefore cannot navigate around. These are sort of what we call unnecessary risks, unnecessary threats that can lead to this type of injury. And so at this time when everything was going on in sort of public discourse, there was this conversation around spend that money in other ways, reduce the likelihood of children being hospitalized by the installment of more playgrounds so that children don't have to independently travel far distances to meet their friends at these locations for recreation and for play purposes. And so I should say around this, the installment of sort of the softer surface in placement of the hard surface was predicted to maybe stop 1 to 2 deaths, as opposed to sort of the 1,300 hospitalizations and other deaths caused by traffic, industrialization, without interference by researchers and the public. And so I think about this a lot when I sort of think of every child matters, but it's also important to consider, allocation of time, of effort, and how we're actually engaging the public to understand where there is need and what we can then do when we know that. Now, there's a book that really influenced what I do, and it's The Last Child in the Woods. It's a book by Richard Louv. And he really speaks to saving our children from nature deficit disorder. And so he was really passionate as a scholar about understanding how the lack of nature-based play in children's life is influencing development, is actually hindering, for example, those who had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, who would benefit from a lot of different learning styles, for example. What the lack of nature education, not only in the school system, but also in the public, would mean for child development. And so he has these really beautiful quotes throughout his book, so I sort of merged two together here. But he says, "Passion is lifted from the earth itself by the muddy hands of the young. It travels along grass-stained sleeves to the heart. Time in nature is not leisure time. It's an essential investment in our children's health and also, by the way, in our own." And so he really talks throughout his book sort of about why it's important to be invested in nature. And he speaks to the education that's involved in learning more about one's environment, not only for survival skills, but also to foster imagination and curiosity, and then what that can lead to in terms of interaction with the outdoor world later on in life. Now, children's understanding of their environment is especially important, arguably throughout their lives. But there are certain age ranges where we see the adoption of threat navigation strategies and safety strategies as really crucial for how they will interact with the world later on as adults. And so I typically will work with children who are aged 4 to 12 because this is seen as when they're starting to introduce through social play, through schools, they're doing various activities, and this is sort of the age range we work with when we think of the strategies they're developing. This actually coincides sort of with the development of inner voice. And so about the age of 5, when children start talking to themselves actively about how they're engaged with their environment. And so they'll go for sort of saying, this is this color, this is this category, to then saying, oh, I want this. I want to do this. This is what I'm doing. And you'll see that sort of curiosity and imagination fostering in their type of play and their navigation of threats. There is some research on how children can perceive threats at different ages. But a lot of this research is actually quite dated. So when we think of like the 1980s was actually a big hub for understanding cognitively how children were developing navigation strategies. And they used a model that I like to think of as Frogger, because I played that game when I was young. And so we sort of see the shift, actually, this very sort of big shift in how children will predict threats and what they will do about that prediction. And so about the ages of 4 to 5, we'll see children start to identify, okay, car is bad. We don't want car in the street. But then it'll jump. And so when you see about 7 or 8, you'll actually see the child think, okay, this car's coming from this direction, I want to walk. Where do I walk? And so they start to sort of piece together sort of this navigation based on the threat they're perceiving. And that's why it's so important when we work with families and with parents especially to understand how they're influencing that type of threat perception in the child. You might see this more clearly as when we think of pointing out a spider. So I had a neighbor who was very afraid of spiders. And so anytime she saw a spider, she used to tell her daughters, spiders are awful, they're bad, we don't go near spiders. And I watched the child sort of look at her and think to themselves, and then after a while, without understanding more about the spider, would point and would jump and would be very afraid. And so we use parental modeling a lot in our research to understand why children adopt safety strategies and how they perceive those threats. It's also why, for example, life jackets are so important for parents and caregivers to model, because we see an increase of children's likelihood of actually wearing the life jacket in the boat, at times increase by about 88%. So when you see sort of parent not wearing a helmet but enforcing that in their child, I always want to be able to say, they're actually looking at you. More than anybody in society can tell them, they're looking at role models, people they care about, that they're trusting with their environment to show them what is a threat and then how to navigate that threat. But they're also developing their own styles of that navigation and their own interests in being able to actively sort of navigate their environment. So children's ability to actually engage in outdoor risky play, so once again, this type of thrilling, exciting play, is really important for the development of confidence. So we see children much more confident, not only in their own abilities, but also in their own independent sort of navigations. Maybe wanting to interact alone, with their environment, feeling okay doing that, not as afraid to do that. And that can translate to how they actually appreciate risk later on in life in various activities. And once again, going back to this sort of navigating of threat and of skills. So I mentioned these studies sort of in the 1980s that I like to think of as Frogger, and this sort of development that coincides with inner voice and how actually children are discussing this within themselves. So they, adopt these types of safety strategies. You can actually watch videos online of children as young as 4 years old learning how to hammer nails. And so children are quite dedicated to their task. If you give them a task and you are sort of supporting them in learning that without helping them, without wanting them to be hurt, they will try to do that task more than they won't. So it's good to actually give children some sort of ability. I'm not suggesting we go home and then we allow children to nail, do carpentry. However, it's good to sort of offer those other opportunities. And physical activity, of course, is sort of a given. When we think of this type of play, we think of, as you all mentioned, right, this type of social outdoor activity, quite often involved with friends. And so through this, there's this a type of imagination. So I've done some work on understanding children's development of microcultures in their play environments, in particular in natural environments, and how access to materials that they can actually take apart and put back together. So we think of tree forts, where they're climbing a tree and putting the branches in that tree and figuring things out together, how they can actually develop this type of culture around that. And so in my work with children, what I'm seeing is quite a few children indicating they want this type of activity away from adults, where they're able to actually develop their own rules. They become a mini sort of society in a way, and they designate roles for one another. So I've had children discuss their idea of a game called camouflage. It's a lot like hide and seek. They'll often sort of adopt what they think of and then come up with a completely new game based on this and add some rules in. But it works because people follow it. They subscribe to this type of ideology that is built around their play environment. I've also had children called We Were Born in the Wilderness, and this was a game they invented around a little waterfall that they found. And so they imagined themselves as healers in their environment. And so they could actually go in, they had imaginary animals that would come, if the animal is wounded, which they often were because of the game, then they would put them in the water and float them and then bring them back out and get out of the lake. And so the animal was healed. And what's interesting about this is because children feel they have opportunity. So they express that they don't feel that they have an adult gaze on that activity. They feel that they can bond with their friends, they have their own sort of games, their own worlds they're creating. And that's important to their connections to that environment. And so when we incorporate sort of risks into that, when we allow them to freely engage, what we find is one of the most common reasons children will engage in any form of outdoor risky play is because they're bored. And so when we think of actually reshaping playgrounds, reshaping spaces to make them more interesting, this is why it's so incredibly important to think of how we can balance those environments, because we want children to be interested. We want them to return with their families to those environments. What we don't want to see is a playground where children are off on the side or running to the forest the first chance they get, because that's where they feel they can best play together. And so unfortunately, what we see is sort of this overriding in public discourse about we need to make things safer, we need to do this, without this balance of sort of interest, curiosity, and the integration of natural, malleable, and unstructured activities and equipment within that. I also wanted to mention there's also this way for parents and children when they are engaged in outdoor activity with risks to bond. And so what we see now, especially in Western societies, is this kind of this idea of, a good parent of removing threat, but literature sort of shows that interactions with children in those environments is a really precious time that parents find to be able to have those types of relationships develop with their children. So we see this very much for example, single parents who want that more time with their child. Some of them might be more likely to actually take them outdoors during their time with the child to have those types of activities. And of course, this is related in a way to this rise in technology, right? So children wanting to spend more time on screens when they're actually indoors. So parents can actually leverage this time outdoors as time with the child to participate in the child's life and to learn more about what their interests are. Now, there are many different initiatives right now, and I'll speak more to a Canadian context. I might touch on what's happening in other countries. But there is quite a lot of movement right now, and this is mostly because, as I've been describing this, you can picture it as a pendulum swinging, right? So whereas before perhaps there were a few hazards we were allowing children to interact with, it's almost now that we are very fearful that it's gone too far, that now we've restricted too much, and we're trying to find ways to balance that and to support them in activities that they're interested in. And so there are different initiatives actually across Canada that are being used right now by families. And I was involved in 2018 with the development of the Unstructured Child-Led Play Toolkit. And this was an initiative by the Canadian Public Health Association. So I was a volunteer and later a project officer for the development of this dissemination of information. And so the goal of this was actually to work with partners, so non-governmental organizations, charities, educators, stakeholders in research and institutions all across Canada over about a 3-year period to understand how we can best actually send out some information about children's outdoor activities and play, while also addressing those fears that we see, right? So fears of stranger danger and sort of traffic and things like this. And the goal was to really be able to say to parents, here's an accessible way to access this information. It's based on sort of informed conversations within communities that are diverse across Canada. And here's a way to sort of access in a quick and very child and family friendly way this type of information. And so that was sort of a bigger initiative. Mind you, we were very fortunate in having funding from the Lawson Foundation. So a lot of these types of initiatives are based on whether or not program coordinators, educators, policymakers feel that they have the resources available to them to be able to send this information out. And there's quite a bit of drawback, of course. So in Canada today, we have adventure and nature camps, and these are camps that are actually offered to families to participate in play activities. They often will engage with risk. And so what we mean by this is play in forests, near lakes. There are educators there who are nature guides. So they will talk about, plant development, have their hands get dirty, and make sure that there's this sort of free time outdoors to interact with the world. There's also a camp I always like to talk about called Dangerous Camp for Kids. It's in Yellowknife, I want to say, up north. And I thought that was really fun, mostly because everyone sort of gasps when they hear that name. I don't know if personally I would recommend that name. There's already a lot of pushback on the risk, but they were sort of going all into this idea of, promote risk, it's good, and here's how we're going to do that. And they actually used their environment to do it. So they had play around ice and different sort of ice fissures in the water, so that children would actually skip from ice block to ice block. They could use ropes, they could use climbing materials and everything. And so these types of initiatives, that camps especially you'll see, are very embedded in this type of education, and this is very important to them. So they'll do like weekly themes or things like this. Currently, my sort of Voices project is in partnership with Thriving Kids Care Society, and as well with a camp here in Vancouver, in Metro Vancouver. And so this is actually a camp based on this sort of education, and my research is actually a complement to the targets they already have in place, which is the type of opportunity researchers such as myself look for, because they're already trusted in the community. We have these relationships we can develop further. They have the allocation of resources, and then we can go in and help. We can help that. So the camp I'm working with currently will have a different themed week. So the one I am going to be collecting data for and working with the kids during is the Safety and Play Week. And so children will be actually working with a professional photojournalist to understand how to take pictures of the outdoor environment, travel through their neighborhoods, and then share their stories and their perspectives on what they find interesting, what they find lacking, any injury spots that they've had. And then we will come up together with a plan for initiating change in that environment. So there's a little bit more movement now in a Canadian context in really appreciating child voice, which is something that has been lacking quite often in these conversations. And I should say, even within that conversation, there are tensions. So much more focused around work with families in urban compared to rural environments, understanding safety strategies in metro areas. And then further, we can talk about traditional, parents and discourses and so on. And so there is this sort of appreciation now for this information dissemination. So how can we work with stakeholders from across nations, across countries, to understand how best to put together practices that can work? And so we're always a little bit skeptical of sending out generalized information. And so I'll give you an example of this. In 2015, there was a position statement on active outdoor play that was released to Canadian families. This was a position statement for the purpose of providing information on safety and play to families across Canada. Now, in doing so, what was left out of that conversation that the families saw was that there are differences in terms of environment. So just today and tonight, we've discussed, right, this sort of context-dependent risk-taking. This idea of, well, how do you tell parents who are working 3 jobs, to come back and then support your child's outdoor risk-taking in a neighborhood where they might be interacting with construction equipment? How do you tell rural parents where hospitalizations are much more frequent, especially around animal and machine-related injury? Yes, allow your child to go outside and play with whatever they want. So there are problems associated with just generalized statements about risk and also safety and injury. So what we're trying to do now especially is untether what the distinguishing features are, so that we can better understand how context and community play a role in that, and then we can tailor our practices to each different community. And I'd like to draw a bit from my research now to sort of complement this conversation. And so what I do a lot of in my work is I understand how parenting styles, and especially their experiences in their own lives, can shape their perspectives on children's outdoor risky play specifically, and also their injury experiences and their access and inclusion within outdoor worlds. And so in my master's research, this was sort of where I was introduced to this topic. And I worked with single stay-at-home and gay fathers to understand perhaps how their experiences, their views on masculinities, and expansions and redefinitions of parenting might play a role in how they perceived outdoor risky play and what they felt they could support in terms of outdoor environment. And so what was interesting throughout that work was, prior to this, we really had not worked with non-traditional fathers in this type of domain. And so I was sort of engaged with a lot of community-oriented practices, the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity, learning more about sort of what these communities were going through, what they wanted out of research and things like this. And I actually feel like the best sort of conversation where they felt comfortable was actually outside sometimes of when, the microphone clicked on. It was really where they could express their fears about having their identities revealed for fear of having their adoption privileges stripped. And they've already expressed sort of how they were considered last for adoption and sort of ostracized in different ways. And so this was an incredibly important thing to consider in working with them. And what I found was sort of this expansions in masculinity, how they were redefining it, what it meant, was sort of related to how they felt they could nurture and care for their child during that outdoor environment. So not feeling like they had to remove their emotion when their child was injured, not feeling like they could be close to that child to support them and sort of develop strategies during play. And so for my PhD, I was then interested in understanding how frequent access to high-risk environment or perhaps dangerous environment might influence or shape parents' perspectives on children's outdoor risky play. So I worked with combat arms in the military and the Department of National Defense. And this was to really understand how experiences in war and combat in particular might influence and shape what parents allow their children to do outdoors, what they believe an injury that is serious is compared to minor, and then what that means for child development in these families. And I also worked actually with wives of these members, and this was to understand gender dynamics also involved in sort of expansions in mothering and fathering, pressures that they might feel at the time, to provide more sort of critical depth with regards to how we were discussing the roles and the risk. And so in doing so, it was sort of the first discussion that came in research about how access to high-risk environment, perhaps high-risk occupation, when we think of paramedics, police officers, firefighters, how those different contexts can actually shape parents' perspectives and then their child rearing through the allowance of risk-taking during play and recreation. And we did see differences. So when we compared, to civilian parents, we did see that, combat arms, especially those who have witnessed atrocities in war, dismemberment when it comes to, gunshot blast injuries, how they were actually distinguishing severe versus minor injury. And so some of those results indicate that actually serious injury was much more serious, and so they actually promoted outdoor risky play to a different degree, perhaps than civilian parents, because they felt like they had witnessed children in other countries overcoming high-risk environment. They saw what people could do in terms of resiliency and in terms of overcoming injury. So those experiences did shape. I had one sort of father talk about how he unfortunately had shot children during war, and then what that did to him in terms of witnessing his own children use Nerf guns outside or water guns. And so he forbade any type of imaginary gun use in his home. And so this is just sort of one example. And so for the mothers, sort of similar sort of processes involved in what pressures they were feeling, especially in militarized communities where there is pressure that's differently shaped, about how mothers should supervise, what role they should take in their communities, what duties they feel they should have around their children. And so this sort of, at times, identifying as being overprotective, wanting to make sure that they were showing up for their children in a way. But once again, I spoke with people. I spoke with a woman who witnessed a boy be run over by a truck. And so she was talking about how everything in her life was built around keeping children away from roads. And so these are just sort of some of examples. I won't go on. Some of them get quite graphic. But examples of actually how interactions with high-risk environment, with witnessing atrocity, death, injury, can shape parenting, especially through how parents allow children to engage with risk outdoors and what they feel their children can overcome in terms of injury. So as a participant told me one time, a blast injury, a gunshot injury is on a different order of magnitude than a broken bone, and then a scrape or a bruise. So that was sort of their anchoring to that idea. It also sort of speaks, a lot of the work I do sort of speaks to this need for inclusivity in research context, so not having the same conversation over and over when it comes to telling parents this is good and this is bad, but really unpacking that, making sure we're critical of the policies, of the programs that come out to make sure that we can actually ameliorate them, strengthen them, and expand them to reach more families and relate more to what individual families might need in those communities. So this is where we see a lot more research happening in terms of community development, outreach, and partnership through co-authorships with these communities, making sure that they are included at the onset as valuable participants in the process. Currently, and I like to sort of go back to this because I think it's just a wonderful initiative that's ongoing. I'm part of some research happening at the University College Cork in Cork, Ireland. And I've been working with a team of researchers for about 3 years now on understanding families that have experienced neurospina bifida and different sort of disabilities regarding mobility, and how we can actually create play and recreational space for these families that are based on those desires, incorporating risky activity for these families that looks a lot different, and normalizing sort of that type of conversation around what can a recreational play environment look like for diverse needs. And so through this work, we're actually seeing that we've worked with a team with engineers who actually have children who have neurospina bifida and experiences. And so the Cran Center, which is a charity who has these sort of programs, recreationally and physical activity programs for these families, the playground is now being developed, and so I am thrilled. So we actually have the current playground and recreational space being developed based on the family's perspectives. So the installment of, let's say, a pirate ship where they can actually touch things and maneuver around, tables that are further up so that when they want to rest from playing, they can fit their wheelchairs underneath and they can speak to people, areas for shade, and especially areas where they can run and walk with crutches, because as they were explaining, a lot of people think we don't want to be on our crutches. And so understanding sort of how they're conceptualizing risk is something that I'm doing currently, but that's sort of the conversation that's ongoing, is how do we create spaces like this that are really fun and really desired by communities that are experiencing different experiences in their lives. How do we make sure we're tailoring it in a way that's not just based on public discourse of fear and risk aversion? So it is important to sort of consider expansions in parenting and in family. And that is it for my presentation today. I did want to spend quite a bit of time. I was hoping, people would show up, so I'm very happy you did. If not, I would talk to Adriana. That's okay. But yeah, we have some time for questions. If you want to have any sort of discussion, I love talking about this. So, yeah.
I'm sorry. Did you have your hand up? No, you definitely were before. So go for it.
Thanks, Les. Thank you, Michelle. That was it was really interesting. I think partly because, I've always been interested in the question of children's development, but from a rather different perspective. Mostly my disciplinary training is in like history and philosophy of science. And I've always been very interested in James Wong wrote a very fascinating dissertation on the very idea of childhood itself and the subject of I don't know, you might know it, you might not, but he wrote it from the perspective of working through the idea of childhood as we think about it, and how developmental psychology played an important role in creating notions like, for example, children became these like beings who were experiencing a different stage of life than adults were, who were developmentally different than adults were, who couldn't, for example, going into the 20th century, be treated like extra farmhands or labor, essentially. Or just, Philip Aries, who wrote about the history of childhood in the 60s, described it as like the miniature adult. They would dress them in like little suits, just as adults in family photos. Yeah. And the reason I bring it up is there was a couple of things you brought up in your presentation along the lines of, your work with fathers and this experience of blame or a sense of responsibility that comes onto the individual parent instead of the child as being raised by perhaps a community, or the responsibility of one child being divided among bigger families. And yeah, I don't know, you probably have a lot to say about that, but I've always been interested in like how the ways that we study childhood, especially because you were talking about the last 6 decades, but even going back further than that, have contributed to this idea that ultimately children develop in these like fixed stages over time, and that therefore, the sandbox generation, you have like tools and instruments that facilitate optimal development as opposed to like full free play of like the Dewey-esque like style. I'm rambling, but I don't know if you have any thoughts about like what's going on with the way that knowledge was itself being developed about children. You said a little bit about the 1980s, but yeah.
No, and I really appreciate a good ramble, so, you could talk for a lot longer. So I agree sort of with where you're coming from with it. There is conversation quite often about developmental stages, how you position yourself. Most of the conversation right now that I've been exposed to comes down to being asked, where do you position yourself? What mode are you using to approach this topic? So some people will say, I believe in developmental stages. I tend to think of it more broadly. So I tend to think of it as, I work sort of primarily with children aged 4 to 12. I'm currently working with them aged 10 to 13. And so we do see differences right along the way. But that's also based on sort of context, socialization, right? What they're being exposed to. High school versus, junior high versus elementary school plays very different. Daycare plays very different, especially how educators treat children will differ depending on the environment that they're being raised in, essentially. So when you were talking about culture, I was thinking, yes, socialization, I would say always, right, is always shaping it somehow. At home environment's very important, where we see a lot of sort of change happen. But also culturally, I think that's why I try to speak more to Western societies. Even within that, cultures differ, right? So I've done some work sort of advocating for more research on Inuit perspectives on what constitutes risk, because now there's much more conversation on indigenous knowledges around what is risky, what does environment have to do, what does culture say? So actually my PhD was supposed to be in a whaling camp in an Inuit community. But feasibility and then community-based work would have taken longer, and it just wasn't as feasible in the end. So then I worked with the Army, because that's very similar. But, there's a lot of advocating right now for understanding different knowledges around it in culture. Yeah, did that sort of answer? That was great, thank you. Yeah, okay.
First of all, thank you. And I'm sorry because I definitely asked you this question like in October, but feel the need to repeat it. So in regards to definition of risk, you previously mentioned how different factors can influence what those definitions are. And I'm curious to what degree you looked at the states and specifically the relation and definition of risk to healthcare access. Because I can imagine my definition of a serious risk is like anything that brings you to the hospital, but when you have good healthcare in the States, you're like, oh, okay, like that's an x-ray, that's okay versus something that requires more intensive care. So I was curious if you ever found risk and say like financial healthcare concerns to be deeply entwined.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have not particularly done this, but I'll speak to two things that I was thinking that sort of are around this type of conversation. So one is the remilitarizing of, societal sort of structures and social structures, especially through politics. So what we've seen in the past, for example, election of conservative government, for example, can actually lead to social structures changing around that access. And so what we see is more sort of militarization around that discourse. So perhaps more traditional perspectives being, discursively produced as what is normalized. And so having an influence then on parents and their perceptions of how much access they should have to their children, how much supervision. And so I would assume sort of that would then shape that type of environment. And then you were sort of speaking to, sorry, I actually know how I want to answer this. So I was thinking of rural versus urban because you were talking about access to healthcare. So what we do see is actually in rural environments or remote environments where parents might have poorer access to perhaps roads, transport, systems of community where they can actually have supervising of other children while they take that child to the hospital. What we see is actually fewer people accessing the hospital, and so changes in what they'll differentiate between serious and non-serious injury. So I actually wrote a paper recently, 2 years ago, on categorizing how rural mothers and fathers versus urban mothers and fathers will actually categorize serious versus non-serious injury. And so what was interesting about that is sort of that discussion around, I think this is serious when I sort of came up with 4 categorizations based on what the families were saying. These were like debilitating injury, so permanent damage, hospitalizations, broken bones, and concussions, because there's much more conversation now about head injury, even in rural communities. And so certainly that changed sort of how they were viewing those categorizations, and then whether or not they felt they could deal with it at home, because that's what they were used to. So they were doing that, they were dealing with it at home, and then they said, well, it can't be serious because we're not accessing a hospital. So hospitalization was sort of big in that way. So I would assume sort of based on, if you did do those studies and poor access to healthcare services, you would see changes in how they're conceptualizing injury in play, and threat probably.
And follow-up question, but I can hold to
Yeah.
obviously let other voices. So follow-up question along the similar lines of access to healthcare, because that can also mean financial or also location. So for instance, when I go back to the States, I just don't have healthcare anymore. So like the activities I do, my own definition of risk and the risks I take in like hiking or something differ, where I am a lot more careful in the States because I know that if I do fall or something, like, yes, $40,000, goodbye. So I'm curious if perhaps risk and ideas of risk or willingness to take risk in parents might also differ with like international travel or something.
Oh, I don't know in particular. I know across literature how they sort of categorize risk is similar, but it's certainly shaped through culture and context. So I would imagine that is the case. I would imagine that is the case, but I don't know of any sort of specific study that has looked at that.
It'd be a really weird niche study of like, okay, so when you go for a trip abroad, what is like the difference in risk? Thank you.
Nice, thank you for this nice topic also. Yes, I would like maybe to dissect the Western culture kind of expression, because I don't think this is Western culture. Because already I would say, Germanic countries are very, very different. And this includes what I've seen on playgrounds in Germany, where I grew up in, Netherlands, then Belgium, Austria, Switzerland. This is what I've seen with my eyes, and also just a few years ago already also. Scandinavia, I don't really know, but maybe it's quite similar. That we see much more, and I was also coming here to North America because I was thinking about, maybe I want to have a family here and I want to stay here, and what would this create for an environment for my children? This is a huge question also for me. And I see here that many playgrounds are very empty and there's just no one playing there. And if there are children playing there, then there's always mom and dad. So I think this is not really Western culture, what we're talking about. This may be in North America only, or maybe includes more other countries or so. But it's very different in Germanic countries already. What I now would say is how my parents, for example, did it with me. So more like letting me go 3 hours away, and then there's only a set time. So there's not like always the parent there. It's just 3 hours you can play in that park or near that river or so, and you can just do it. So there's this notion of trust. And maybe, I don't know, maybe there has to be a more conversation culture or so with the child, or invested into conversation with children, really discussing with children. So discuss with your child, and if your child is able to persuade you that it can go out now 3 or 4 hours alone or with a few friends, this increases stimulation of the brain, of course, of the child. It can persuade someone, mom and dad, plus then gets the trust, plus gets the independence, gets the freedom of doing what the child is able to persuade. So this is what I feel like is maybe was a bit more in my childhood, and it still is this way when I see the playgrounds in the different places. Children are everywhere in Germany. They are on the buses alone, tiny kids, 7-year-olds. They are running with groups of 3 people or so. So there's also the example of it can be different. What do you say about this? Maybe, it's quite difficult to get this conversation culture and discussion culture, maybe, and trust culture in your children. How to get this into society? This is, and just only to know that this is not Western culture, but it's maybe a few countries could be liberating, because there's an example out there which is very different.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing your perspective as well, because that's very valuable, right? Like, that's what we talk about is, what are you seeing? What do you see in terms of the generations and the changes and things? I believe you are right, sort of in terms of, yes, there are differences in terms of what you see for children. What we will commonly do is try to understand the fears that are around it, conduct needs assessments to understand, right, what needs really do need addressing. So a big conversation right now in Canada is around stranger danger versus, traffic, and there are very different risks. If you're talking about risk in terms of probability of harm, very different risk. I don't want to misquote this statistic, but it's something like, out of all the children that are abducted, right, per year in Canada, let's say it's like 40,000, but 16 are strangers. So it's really sort of bringing statistics to the forefront to say, actually, quite a lot of violence, intentional violence, is enacted against children from people they know, and especially within family contexts, or people that know the family and things. So bringing that sort of to the forefront of conversation, working with parents to understand where that comes from, my work with military families, one mother described it as, "I've seen what evil men do." And so her fear around strangers was not just based on what she heard in the neighborhood, what she was witnessing on television, which is a big production of fear around stranger danger currently, but instead was actually built around, I've seen what evil men do against my husband in war, shooting his arm off. Like that, I've seen what they do. People have malintent. People can do bad things. I don't want my child around strangers for those reasons. So there are different influences around that, certainly, right? Trauma, grief, like everything that you've experienced. And so certainly it's cultural dependent, it's context dependent. What we typically will look at is successful implementation of playground structures in other countries. So in Scandinavia especially, they have sort of more resources allocated currently towards developing adventure-based playgrounds. If you're really interested in adventure-based playground, Richmond has a really good one by the airport. But I will say, because I walked around it and I said, privilege. So that's also always on my mind, right? It was, where are these playgrounds being developed that have these really well-balanced risks versus safety, right? It's privilege, it's access, it's what communities have the money to install those types of playground equipment there, to do the research and work with them to say, okay, now we can advocate for the installment. So when I think of, the soldier who was saying, I saw a 6-year-old on the side of the road carrying a 4-year-old, I'm no longer afraid that my child's gonna fall and scrape his knee, right? I know what children are capable of doing. We're overprotected in Canada. That was sort of a conversation that kept happening with combat arms who had been overseas in different countries, because they're witnessing that. But so I always come back to, being able to advocate for child safety, the tailoring, right? Being able to afford 300 million euros to change playground equipment from hard to soft surfaces, that's a privilege of a country to be able to do, because not all countries are going to be able to invest that money into changing the playground, right? Nor would it be a priority area that's brought up at that meeting, right? So yeah, there are differences. Japan does forest schools where children can climb trees sometimes to their classrooms. They wear little harnesses and they go up the tree. So there are so many great examples. So what we're trying to do is understand those, how it was shaped by culture, perhaps how we can adopt some of those practices, what that would cost to do. But you will see differences in different countries, certainly.
Very nice, thank you.
Thanks.
I just have a comment. This is super interesting, Michelle, and thank you for validating a good portion of my childhood. So I grew up with an oncologist as a father, and a nurse for a mother who has worked in ICU settings. And my siblings and I have always theorized that they have something that we call doctor-parent syndrome, which is where anything that happens to your kid can't be nearly as bad as the shit that you've seen happen to them to people in hospital settings. So yeah, this has been really interesting to me, and I'm wondering I'm sure it's much more severe in people who've seen combat and such, but I am really interested if knowledge and exposure to healthcare settings also, because I feel I also know people who have doctors as parents where it works in reverse, where they have super risk-adverse parents, and it's interesting.
So what I used to come back to my mind is this. So the one interview I've done that stands out more than I would say any other in terms of vividness is when I first started my master's, and I was working with a father who was a single father, and I had no idea really what I was doing looking back, right? I was ready to go. I was at the cafe, 11 o'clock at night, I'm ready with my microphone, let's do it. And so a father sat down, and he was lovely, and we spoke for about an hour and a half at the back of the cafe, and for about half of that time, he was crying, just crying his eyes out. And it turned out that he wanted to talk to me about how he feels overprotective because his 6-year-old son died of septic shock over a 2-day period, and he didn't get him to the hospital in time. So the child died as soon as they reached the hospital. And so he talked to me about seeing angels. He talked to me about his divorce not soon after the child's death, about how his surviving child is overprotected and what grief does to a family. That was a conversation I had never come across in literature before. And that actually started me on why I do what I do. Because when I heard that, I realized it's not about just, falling off of a bike. It's not always just about wearing a helmet. It's about the conversation behind that and the purposes behind that. So understanding sort of access, right, as you said, if you've witnessed injury, if you are the person mending those injuries, perhaps in a hospital setting, what you know the body can recover from. So all of that does inform what parents are able to do. How, if they trust the hospital system, right, enough to bring their child. So it always sort of comes back to that context. And then how we can use that somehow to inform the practices that we have.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Super interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, this was a great presentation, Michelle. Like, I've learned a lot, and like Adriana said, it does validate a lot of my childhood. I actually wanted to I think you brought it up briefly in answering Merlin's question, but you talked about stranger danger and the effects of media, and I actually did want to ask, how does the rise of social media and technology and like this generation of kids impact like risk-averse parents versus also the risks they take? I know my mom's an educational assistant, but she was a stay-at-home mom with me and my brother for growing up in child. So like she's seen like the difference between like the development of technology and the use that and the privilege of access to this technology that children get. And she says that they like know so much more on the internet than she like ever was prepared for coming back into the workforce, and how they are dealing with all this like stuff that maybe parents are not prepared for. So I was just wondering how that impacts both how parents react to risk, but also maybe are kids taking more risks than they would have in the past without knowledge to all this stuff that they wouldn't have previously known, or is it the opposite? So I just was wondering if you've ever encountered this in your research.
Yeah. So what we see right now is quite a lot of sensationalization around injury, abduction, things like this. So one thing I always speak to is I would never say, it doesn't matter. It always matters. That one child who is abducted by a stranger matters. But how we talk about it also matters. What we do because of it matters, right? So if we're then saying as a society, every few times something happens, we can't do any of these things without balance, without understanding how we might be able to say, okay, well, here's how to avoid this particular circumstance, but also let's balance this with this other opportunity. If we just obliterate threat instead of understanding it, that's where it can become quite detrimental to development. And so sort of when you're speaking about social media, there is sort of, I would say that's a big problem, is the sensationalization without information to back that up, right? Child was abducted, here's where they're abducted, the person's on the loose, and then that's it, and it's just this big conversation. That's great, but it's also good to have those conversations with parents about, in your community, here's statistics, here are also your fears, and this is what you've been saying about it. Here are information portals you can access to, if you have those questions, instead of going to your neighbor who might also be really, scared at this time. Here's a site you can go on that's very easy to access. We asked families like yourself, we know it's good to access, it's easy for you to do. You can feel confident and comfortable doing that. Here's some information that's backed by evidence. Here's some research to go with it that's fun and playful and nice to look at. That's sort of a step we're trying to take right now, is to make that very accessible online. Parents will also tend to use social media as a community to voice threats. So that can be good, right? It's nice to feel like you have some support, especially as we tend to live in very individualized societies, especially in Canada and the United States and things, where it might not be that, as sort of you mentioned, right, that there's this community raising the child, which might be much more normalized elsewhere. So within Canada, you will see it, Inuit, for example, military spouses who have indicated they do use social media to look for threats. They also want to understand if they have somewhere to be, it's a necessity to rely on community. They don't have the option of dropping what they're doing, leaving their children at home and taking one child to the hospital, right? They have to be able to find support. If they're moving around all the time, the community they move into matters, right? So social media can be good and it can be bad. I think it's just about
making sure that the access people have is complementing what's going on in their community, and complementing what they can do themselves to rectify the situation, to give people the tools so that if you can't access a hospital right away, okay, here are some maybe other methods you can use right now that aren't just off of like Google, right? Here's how to do it. So that's what we try to do, is use social media to our advantage, because it's not going away.
Awesome, thanks.
So I sort of have maybe a strange question, but I want to get sort of what you've seen or maybe some of your hypotheses about this. But I was wondering, for kids who grow up in those very sheltered sort of systems, like very safety conscious parents, have you noticed any benefit to them being exposed to sort of like outdoor risk or just like outdoors in general, and sort of in later childhood stages, in adolescence? Do you think there'd be big differences there, or like benefits, disadvantages, sort of thing?
I think it's hard to say a blanket, yes, there are benefits, no, there are not. I think certainly different types of parenting styles can hinder development. However, there are always benefits associated with that too, right? So relationship building with parents and caregivers, knowing you have that extra support. Oftentimes children who are independently mobile, so who are not supervised as they're walking outside, let's say, if they know they have that comfort or access to a parent, to a caregiver through a device, tablet, phone, this is very common now, then they'll feel a little bit better. So I guess that comfort that can come through that, certainly. Wanting to overcome perhaps a threat depends on the parenting style and depends on what the child wants. So we see, it's always dependent on the child. We always say, we're not just trying to tell everybody to go climb a tree. It's really, if the child does not want to climb the tree, don't force them up the tree, right? Like, don't do that. Some children don't want to do this. And children know, it's sort of about giving children agency too, to know their boundaries, their environments, and listening to them as people, right? Not as lesser than, dependent on, or in need of. And that's incredibly important, because right now we tend not to do that, and we tend to structure environments without their consent, without their understanding, and we say, we know it's best. Unfortunately, we don't always know it's best. And so leaving them out of that conversation can be especially hindering to their development and the society we're developing 50 years from now.
Awesome, thank you.
Kind of to piggyback a little bit off of treating children as though they are actually people. I'm wondering if you could speak at all to, I guess, unsupervised group play and the difference between here are a bunch of 10-year-olds versus here are some 6-year-olds and also some 12-year-olds, where the 12-year-olds are kind of responsible for taking care of the 6-year-olds.
Yeah, so actually right now, especially in different programs, camp environments, things like this, there are benefits, there are consequences. It's pretty much my discussion the whole way through. But certainly we see in playgrounds where there's equipment that entices or engages all children of different ages. We do see sort of younger children taking more, perhaps risks, engaging in more thrill, especially sibling-related play, right? Play where your friends are older, trying to keep up, trying to take those risks. Sometimes that can result in a consequence, right? Climbing a structure when you don't really know how to get down. So there are it's a learning experience, I think, but there have been benefits shown with that type of environment that mixes. But we also see, not only through socialization, but also just a child's desire. They sometimes want to just form groups with people in their ages. And you will see like the need that has to do with that play is very different. So for 10 to 13-year-olds who are engaging, let's say, in a game-based play, that game would look very, very different perhaps than We're Born in the Wilderness, right? Which is perhaps younger children saying, I want to imagine we're healing animals. Maybe a 13-year-old saying, actually, I want to spy on people from the hammock we created in this secret place, right? So they use environments very differently and for different purposes in terms of their cultural development within groups. So there are benefits and there are also consequences.
Thank you.
My answer.
Okay, sorry to take up so much of your time. But follow up on previous question is actually in regards to social media, so I'm so glad you started to ask it. So I know that you mentioned how like children are obviously modeling some of their parents' ideas of what risk is with the spider example. Yeah. And I'm curious to know along a similar line of with the rise of like TikTok and Instagram and those sort of like cinnamon challenges where do kids' ideas of risk, have they changed with this rise in social media, especially in seeing like X number of influencers do Y, where they no longer see that as a risk? It's, well, these people have done it. So I'm curious of your perspective on that.
I can only speak to what I would think about it. I don't know any studies involved in that. So I would assume just because people, well, children and youth will always sort of, some will model quite heavily. And so in the cases of following people who are normalizing specific, what we would call risks and perhaps not calling them risks, they might not call those risks, right? We see that in other societies where there are different definitions regarding risks. Perhaps to us, jumping from ice block to ice block at the age of 5, unsupervised is risky. Perhaps to an Inuit parent who's, that's normal. That's just not a risk. That's just something that the child's doing, which is good play. So I think certainly the definitions change depending on context. And even as we're learning more about like tracking devices and the use of mobile technology, I'm sure that TikTok and exposure in general influences this. Children watching TV and seeing different risks in those television shows would influence it. So yeah, probably the normalizing. I will say though, children tend to adopt a lot of sort of mentalities around things sometimes. So maybe this is off topic, but it sort of brought this to my mind. I was working with a father one time who was very identified as very hegemonically masculine. So very like, I'm protector, I'm guard, I don't show emotion when it comes to my child, but I want my child to be great and to develop healthfully. And so he adopted a boy out of a really bad environment from another country. And the child was he described the child as very fragile because the mother had tried to kill his son. I won't get into it because it's very graphic. But so when he adopted him, he was just like, he had described him as very skin and bones, timid, was getting bullied, everything. So he actually bought him a dirt bike and was like, you're using the dirt bike. You're going to dirt bike every day. You're going to be fantastic at dirt biking. Everyone's going to look up to you. And he did. And he was the best dirt biker in the whole town. I don't mean to laugh, but that's actually what happened. And so the child was actually very, very confident, but was adopting that type of mentality around it, right? Because it was normalizing this process of, I need to be tough in, social settings, I need to be this. And so the risk was then lessened, right? I'm not as afraid to do this thing, it's not a threat because my dad's telling me it's not a threat. And also my friends are looking up to me now and seeing me as this confident person. So like, why would I consider this risky to do? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And that, it just reminded me, as you described sort of this like normalizing behavior through TikTok, it wouldn't surprise me if then you saw differences in how children were either redefining or conceptualizing, what risk is based on who they look up to and who they want to become based on that exposure.
Yeah, Liz, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I think the live stream is going to turn off, so maybe we could just end by no means does the conversation have to end, but perhaps we could give Michelle a formal, round of applause. Thank you all so much for being here today. Walker will be presenting next Monday. You have to read the description of this talk because this just sounds unbelievable. I love electronic music, and I'm really, really excited for that. But thank you, Michelle. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, audience. Okay.